The priest's voice echoed through the church as he recited the vows to bind the couple. Sue Rowland pledged her loyalty to her groom, but all she wanted to do was punch him in the face. The vows had already been spoken, and she still couldn't figure out how things had gotten so messed up. How did she end up having to kiss this guy, who was like a real piece of work? The city of Ardell was known as a pleasure and gambling hub, full of people chasing their dreams. Sue Rowland was a regular at the illegal gambling dens. She made a living by cleaning out losers who made crazy bets and ended up with nothing. The police fought against illegal gambling and often conducted raids. But Sue always managed to avoid getting caught by pretending she was just there looking for her brother. Every time, she lied that she was just passing through, and she got away with it. Sue Rowland was 24 years old, and for her age, she was a seasoned hustler who loved money. Money meant so much to her, she'd practically sell her soul for it. That's why she loved this rotten city so much. Even street kids like her could make a good living. Coming home one of those days, Sue found Mel studying how to play cards. This really ticked her off, because the kid was only 14 years old. She herself had been forced to become a con artist and card sharp to feed newborn Mel. Even though they weren't blood-related at all, she thought of him as her little brother and wanted the best for him. She wanted Mel to stop messing around, get serious, and study, because he dreamed of becoming a knight. But the kid doubted he could achieve that as a commoner, since not everything in the world can be achieved just through hard work. And then it occurred to her that they could change their identity, and all they needed to do was buy a noble title. Sue heard it would take around 200,000 gold, which she figured she could make by pulling off a couple of big scores. She took it on herself in exchange for Mel promising to get his button gear and train. The very next day, our girl headed to Hector, who was the big cheese at the Rudanti Scammer Center. And even though the guy thought she was nuts when she asked him for a 100,000 gold job, Sue was dead serious. So Hector told the con artist that a real VIP was visiting Ardell, Duke Miramonte. This knight was a war hero, better known to the public as Sir Chantak. There were even whispers going around that he iced his own brother to inherit the title. Hector's specialty was luring lords to the gambling table. Sue, for her part, was supposed to play the part of a naive daughter of some backwater baron. Our hero walked into the place, already knowing that Duke Miramonte would be on the top floor of the building. Seeing him, the girl was floored. Chantak was way hotter than she'd heard. Hector warned Sue beforehand that the Duke was super shady, so he promised to send backup. Just as Miramonte was giving our girl the stink eye, the promised support swooped in from behind. Sue knew Veronica well. She was part of the Rudanti crew. Those two just never clicked. Her partner introduced the heroine to the Duke, saying her name was Marlene, and she was the great niece of her second cousin. Sue immediately played along with Veronica and reminded her that she'd promised to teach her how to play recat. Still playing the country bumpkin, she suggested His Grace join in on her lessons. Without missing a beat, Miramonte agreed, and a few minutes later, they were at the game table with a few other plants. Veronica immediately suggested raising the stakes, which surprised the Duke, since her relative was supposedly clueless. This so-called Marlene, however, agreed, saying beginners usually get lucky. With the heroine's heel clicks setting the rhythm, all the players started raising their bets. The Duke won the first game. The crook's plan was to give him some hope at first, then bleed him dry. But then, out of nowhere, Miramonte asked the girl to stop clicking her heel. The heroine flinched. It was clear the Duke was onto them. Proof of that was when he asked one of the cheaters to close the curtains, and another to get him some water. But the fact that Miramonte knew what was up but kept quiet meant he either had an angle or he was just a twisted freak. Holding out the cards to Sue Rowland, he offered to give her private gambling lessons. The heroine gave a fake laugh and said she'd had enough of this boring game. Instead, she suggested the Duke play a round of Shakal spell with her. During the game, Sue tried to figure out why Miramonte was looking at her like he knew who she really was. Besides, she couldn't shake the feeling that she'd seen him somewhere before. Suddenly, it hit her, and Sue asked the Duke point-blank if he'd seen her hustling people. Chantak confirmed her suspicion, saying he'd actually seen her about a week prior. What's more, he totally knew this brazen chick was planning to pull the same stunt on him. After finding out her age, Miramonte said she'd be a perfect fit, though she had no idea for what. He proposed they bet on their game, promising to grant her any wish if she won. But if she lost, she'd have to work under him for 2 years. The heroine agreed, figuring those 100,000 gold coins were practically hers already. Sue Rowland was certain that a con artist as skilled as she was simply couldn't lose. Nevertheless, hard as it was to believe, the girl actually lost. Turns out Miramonte was a total newbie at the game, but since it was all about tactics, he picked it up quick. This strategy game, Shakaspell, was based on the epic 10-Year War. Every unit in general has unique abilities, and you win by either scoring 100 points or taking out the king. The Duke was a war master, so no surprise he was pulling off moves that nobody else even thought of. And since Miramonte won, he told the heroine he needed her as a pretend wife. Sue didn't get why she was the one he wanted. The guy could have snagged hundreds of fake wives. But judging by the test the Duke put her through, a regular fake wife just wouldn't cut it for this job. Miramonte confirmed her suspicions. He needed her particular talents for deception. And the person they had to fool was none other than King Villatan himself, Javier. Not long before, Chantac del Casa Miramonte had received a letter from His Majesty. Turns out, he deliberately sent the Duke to Ardell, famous for its beautiful women. The king was hoping he'd find a woman there who could melt his ice-cold heart. He wrote that he couldn't sleep at night, worrying about what might happen to the Miramonte estate if Chantac died in battle without an heir. The king threatened to withhold his ducal title until he found a wife in Ardell. Chantac, furious, crumpled the letter, tossed it aside and turned to the window. That's when he saw Sue Rowland, who was just then skillfully slipping out of the cop's hands. After learning exactly why he needed her, the heroine agreed to the scheme. However, she demanded compensation for her services, and even though Miramonte reminded her about her loss, the girl, in turn, reminded him that she hadn't said she was going to work for free. Chantac couldn't argue with that, and then Sue named her price, 100,000 gold. Miramonte tried to lowball her at 50 grand, but she shot back that she's risking her reputation, which would be toast nationwide. Unlike a regular con, she'd have to play this part for years, and after that, she'd probably be unmarriageable. Chantac kept haggling, offering Sue 60 grand and saying he could find another girl. But she was confident he wouldn't find anyone better than her for the job. Miramonte thought it over and offered her 80,000 gold, plus room and board in the castle. The con artist agreed, and they shook on it. But while signing the contract, Sue demanded a bonus if things went well, because the target was the king, and any slip-up could cost her dearly. Since she was putting her neck on the line, she wanted extra pay for the risk, which was starting to drive Chantac nuts. He reminded her that she was sitting in front of the sword of Villatan himself, and told her to remember that title. The Miramonte ducal house had protected the royal family for generations and was like the capital's fortress, so she had nothing to worry about there. Sue wasn't buying anything without proof, which amazed Chantac, seeing how such a tiny thing could argue so much. The girl scoffed and reminded him that they were at the negotiating table. In the end, Miramonte agreed, but removed the clause about expenses for the business deal, since he'd already deducted the cost of lodging at the castle. Sue agreed, chuckling at how greedy rich people really were. Finally, the contract was ready, and instead of a signature, the heroine, as usual, drew her symbol, a little rabbit. Seeing the Duke's long signature, the girl was shocked, wondering how he didn't get tongue-tied having to say his own name. Putting the contract in his pocket, Chantac ordered the girl to come to him, warning her in advance that he wouldn't tolerate disobedience. As soon as she stood up, he grabbed her arm and neck and yanked her close. Just then, the door burst open and several people noisily barged into the room. Miramonte said that was a little uncalled for, since they were just starting to get along. The heroine forced a laugh, secretly thinking she should have asked for a hazard bonus. In just a couple of days, the news hit the papers. Duke Miramonte had fallen head over heels for a mysterious woman at one of Ardell's casinos. Every aristocrat was absolutely livid when they heard, since each of them was angling to become Chantac's sweetheart. Seeing Sue reading the papers, Miramonte suggested she focus on something more important. He handed her a book containing the entire history of his family, asking her to at least learn the basics. She tried to object, pointing out that she wasn't making him learn her family history. Chantac replied that it wasn't necessary, mainly because from that day on, she'd have a new identity. Marlene Sue Sinclair. He handed her some documents with all the necessary information, asking her to study them carefully. According to these papers, Sue was a lady from a bankrupt baronial family that had settled on the outskirts of Ardell. The heroine, in turn, had prepared a story about the circumstances under which she and the Duke had met. She also gave a quick rundown of the events and feelings that led to her falling in love, and just in case, made a list of everyone they were dating back then. Sue wrote everything down based on the gossip rags, so there shouldn't be any mistakes. Before our girl could even show him the work she'd done, Shantak announced he'd already memorized it all. Not wanting to waste any time, he invited the girl to etiquette lessons. The heroes decided to head to the capital, Bahu, in 2 weeks. Until then, Sue had to prepare to perfectly transform into the future Duchess of Ardell. Etiquette lessons were incredibly exhausting for the girl, and she begged to stop, thinking she'd already learned everything. However, Miramonte insisted they would continue until Madame Keller was completely satisfied with the result. And she, in turn, kept saying that Sue still had neither grace in her movements nor a solid foundation. It was obvious to her that this girl was just a commoner from the Free South, and to avoid suspicion in the capital, she needed a complete makeover. All those different bows she had to learn for each member of the royal family were driving her nuts. Sue was dying to go home, but she had to make money for Mel, and that's what kept her here. Finally, the lesson was over, and she was free to meet with Veronica. Before she left, the Duke hoped she wouldn't say anything too stupid while she was there. Veronica greeted her partner with a pissed-off look, because she'd been wondering ever since why Miramonte only invited Sue. Even though she doubted the Duke was actually smitten with Roland, that's what Sue claimed. Veronica couldn't figure out what he saw in someone like Sue, who was always just hustling for cash and ready to stab you in the back. Still, whatever, she knew the con artist didn't invite her here for nothing. She handed Veronica a key to the safe and explained how to open it. There should be a pouch in the safe, with about 20,000 gold pieces inside. That should have been enough to buy Mel's new status, and Sue asked the girl to help him with it, promising to send the rest later. When Veronica took the key, our girl decided to warn her not to do anything stupid, just in case. If the truth about Sue's connection to Rudanti comes out, this ain't gonna end with just a few arrests. Veronica said she understood, wished her luck, and told her not to worry about Mel. Our girl was creeped out by that sickeningly sweet concern, and she wasn't about to miss the chance to get a jab in. A second later, the girls were going at it, hair flying, and Madame Keller, who came running at the noise, was yelling at the lady to keep it classy. Finally, Veronica left, and now it was really time for Sue to get out of Ardell. She couldn't believe she was leaving the place she'd lived her whole life. Sue crouched down, admiring the flowers, and casually wondering how much dough she could make selling these seedlings. Before she could reach for a plant, some dude's voice from behind her advised her not to. That was a super rare flower called a celerin, only grows up north, and since the Duke prized it, the girl could get seriously punished for picking it. After explaining all that, the guy introduced himself as His Grace's bodyguard, Fernando. The heroine was surprised that Villeton's sword had a bodyguard, and the guy, looking embarrassed, admitted he didn't really do much for the Duke. You could tell he was a bodyguard in name only. A big shot like that couldn't just wander around without an escort, you know? Fernando also doubled as the mansion supervisor. Sue thought it was weird that a place with just a handful of maids and Madame Keller needed supervision. She figured the so-called bodyguard was just a spy sent by Chantak, and that meant the Duke didn't trust her. Even back when Sue was a member of Rudante, she always carried out her assignments faithfully. Even when things got so rough they were starving, she never blew a job or strong-armed anyone for money, because those were the rules of the game. So the Duke just figures he can trash her reputation like that, thinking con artists don't have any pride? Noticing the lady staring him down, Fernando asked her what was up. He was totally surprised when she asked if he was from the South, because he actually was. She said it was his name, it just had that Southern vibe, and then she added that she was from there too. Sue totally made that up. Knowing a shared hometown is a great way to break down someone's guard. Getting all excited, Fernando said he could actually hear a hint of a Southern accent in her voice, even though that wasn't true at all. He told her he grew up in a town called Costa Rica, and she lied again, saying she was from there too. Grabbing his hands, Sue gushed about how happy she was to meet someone from back home. While telling Fernando all about her favorite fruits from Costa Rica, she was subtly checking out his hands. The guy's palms were calloused, and judging by how red he got just from her touching him, he was just a regular country bumpkin. The more Sue looked at Fernando, the more she realized how easy Veronica could manipulate him. Since they were talking about the Laranki trees, the guy offered to show Lady Marlene them in the garden. He was going to escort her, saying the Duke was worried about her safety. But the heroine faked a tear and said she wanted to enjoy the view of those trees alone before leaving. The trick worked, and Fernando let her go by herself, promising not to tell the Duke. Thanking him for his kindness, Sue left, pissed at Shantak for daring to assign her a babysitter. The day was already coming to an end when Duke Miramonte found Sue sitting in one of the trees in the garden. He demanded she get down immediately, but she just laughed and refused. Shantak reminded her, again, that he wouldn't tolerate disobedience. But Sue figured that kind of thing only works in relationships built on mutual respect. And even though Miramonte said he trusted her, that just cracked her up. Realizing they were talking about Fernando, the Duke explained that he'd ordered him to protect Sue, but she was sure that on top of that, the guy was supposed to report her actions and words back to his boss. Shantak kept insisting that the guard was necessary for her safety, so she made the Duke swear on his honor that he wouldn't get reports from Fernando, and he promised her that. After that, Miramonte told her to come down, but it turned out she'd climbed too high and was stuck in the tree. The man sighed and told Sue to jump, promising he'd catch her. She grabbed the nearest branch, getting ready to jump, but still super worried about getting hurt. Just then, the branch suddenly snapped, and Sue went tumbling out of the tree. As she fell, all she could think about was not messing up her hands, which were so important for a con artist. As he braced to catch her, the Duke couldn't help but think about it. Even a war hero needs to keep his hands in top shape. She landed right on Shantak, which made the fall a lot softer than it could have been. Now that she was seeing him up close like this, she suddenly noticed just how handsome he actually was. Jumping to her feet, Sue apologized and thanked the Duke, complimenting him on his incredible reflexes. She even offered him a job with her at the circus if he ever got tired of his current gig. Listening to her chatter, Miramonte concluded that the girl could definitely use a few more etiquette lessons. He went to find Madame Keller, and Sue rushed after him, begging him not to. Nevertheless, she spent all her remaining time before leaving for Bahu in special training. The day before she left, she spent almost the entire day trying to convince the Duke to let her go out for a little while. And even though he remained firm, she argued that she didn't know when she'd be back in Ardell. Shantak was trying to explain to her that she was now Marlene Sue Sinclair, who, according to the story, never had a brother in the first place. The heroine promised to meet with Mel in a way that no one would notice. Shantak just couldn't understand why she needed to see her brother in person if she had entrusted his care to Veronica. Sue insisted that she needed to because Mel was her precious little brother, and then the Duke suddenly froze. At that moment, memories of the times he spent with Theodore flashed vividly through his mind. Sue didn't miss the change in the Duke's face, and she asked if he was all right. Miramonte paused, and then asked if she really loved her brother that much. Doubting that it would affect his decision in any way, the heroine answered affirmatively. But to her surprise, Shantak suddenly let Sue go. However, he didn't want her to go alone, and assigned Fernando to escort her. Not wanting to hear any objections, the Duke told the girl to hurry. She thanked His Grace anyway and promised to be careful. When they got back, Sue told Fernando to wait for her outside. The guy tried to argue, but she told him it was an order from the future Duchess. Mel was super surprised when Sue suddenly walked in. He rushed to hug her, totally confused about where she'd been all this time. The heroine learned that Veronica had visited Mel, just like she'd asked. She said he should go to the Royal Villetan Academy, so he could become a knight after graduating. Veronica explained that her distant relative, Viscount Hiller, could adopt Mel so he wouldn't be a commoner anymore and could get in. The heroine was happy to hear that and gently ruffled her brother's hair. She noticed his hair was getting too long and told him to sit down so she could give him a trim before she left. To get into the Royal Academy, Mel needed to look sharp, so Sue started working on his hair. When he heard his sister was leaving Ardell for a long time, the guy figured she'd gotten caught doing something shady and offered to bribe the judge for her. But Sue explained she just landed a really good-paying gig. She told Mel not to sweat it and just focus on his studies. Plus, she ordered her brother to make sure no stuck-up nobles dared to mess with him at the academy. But Mel wasn't about to let anyone push him around. Not when he was the brother of Sue Rowland. She promised the guy she'd be back as soon as her job was done. When he found out she was heading to Baja, Mel was bummed, 'cause that was way too far from Ardell. When he asked how long she planned to be there, Sue, without turning around, said she didn't know yet. Mel sadly hung his head, figuring his sister was working herself to the bone because of him. She cupped his face in her hands, begging him to stop all this, promising she'd make enough money so they could live like royalty for the rest of their lives. She hugged Mel tight, told him not to worry, to eat well at the academy, and not be picky while she was gone. Fernando's voice echoed from the street, and Sue knew she had to leave. Before leaving, she told Mel to play dumb and say he didn't know anything if some stranger started asking about her. The boy's eyes were full of sadness as he waved goodbye to his beloved sister. Stepping outside, she felt a wave of relief knowing Mel would be going to the academy. Now, all that was left was dealing with Fernando, who was waiting for her with the face of a puppy who needed to go. He complained that she was late, but Sue calmed him down, saying the Duke probably expected it when he gave them so little time. Fernando was shaking in his boots, because before leaving, Miramonte threatened to beat him to a pulp if they were late. The next day started with the Duke scooping her up and turning her upside down. Even though Sue figured he was just punishing her for yesterday, that wasn't it at all. Because a split second later, his hunch was confirmed, and the first gemstone hit the floor. Shantak started shaking her, and more jewels spilled out with her scream, following the first one. He lowered her to the floor, amazed at how slick she was, and that she only stole small stuff from the estate. As she ran from him, our girl complimented the Duke on his sharp eyes, since she'd never been caught before. On the way to the hallway, she bumped into Fernando, who freaked out seeing her run from the office. He thought the Duke had called Lady Marlene in to punish her for being late yesterday. Everything was ready for departure, and our girl went to the carriage, feeling totally awesome. She managed to keep a couple of the stones, the very ones she wanted most. Sue hid one in her sock and pinned the other in her hair. She was already climbing into the carriage when the Duke called out from behind, and she froze, thinking he'd caught her again. Turning around, Sue saw Chantak offering his hand to help her into the carriage. Like a proper lady, she placed her hand in his, wondering why the Duke was staring at her so intently. Silently, Miramonte reached out and plucked the stolen hairpin from her hair. To avoid raising suspicion among the servants, he said with a smile that Marlene looked better with her hair down. The trick worked, and the maids just gushed over the Duke's display of affection. Even though she was furious that he'd even noticed, Sue tried to take back the hairpin, arguing that long hair was much easier to manage when it was up. But no matter how she tried to grab the ornament, Shantak wasn't about to give it back. Already seated in the carriage, Sue called the Duke a filthy rich jerk, but he replied that his wealth didn't mean she could just go around touching his stuff. And while she kept going on about how he could have just let her have one hairpin, Miramonte started checking out her legs. He sighed heavily, bent down, and started pulling off the girl's sock. No matter how much she resisted, the Duke still managed to find the hidden trinket there. According to him, finding the weaknesses in the southern defenses was way easier than tracking down Sue's stolen jewels. The heroine had no choice but to apologize and praise Shantak for managing to find them all. Along the way, she looked at the Duke and thought about how gorgeous that cheapskate was, like he was from another world. But a guy who looks like that will never get to enjoy life. He's dedicated his whole life to fighting on the battlefield, and he's probably destined to die there too. Under Sue's intense gaze, Miramonte opened his eyes and asked why she was staring at him like that. The girl admitted she thought he was really handsome, and he told her not to even think about it. The heroine declared that there was nothing for her to swipe in such a cramped and boring place, and then suddenly discovered some games under the table. She suggested they play a game, but Shantak remembered she never plays unless there's something on the line. Sue proposed the Duke put up that trinket he took from her, and she'd wager a piece of fruit. Miramonte didn't like those odds, so he suggested Sue bet her, well, let's just say her good name. Setting up the table, he declared if she lost, she could never, ever mislead him again. She tried to argue, saying she never misled him anyway, but he gave her such a hard look, she immediately agreed to his terms. She was confident she'd win, even without any sneaky help, and started shuffling the cards. Looking at the deck, she figured it hadn't been used before. That gave her an edge, since Sue knew the order of the cards in a fresh deck. So she dealt the Duke a bunch of low cards and took the high ones for herself. Even so, Shantak still managed to beat her, even with that setup. The heroine couldn't believe he was even good at this, seeing as he'd beaten her twice. She was starting to think Miramonte was actually a hardcore gambler. But he shot that down, explaining he just figured she'd definitely try some tricks on him. He didn't see exactly what she was doing, but he was sure of her, competitive spirit, and factored that in. Hearing that, the heroine smirked, and suddenly got lost in thought. She suggested they team up, saying they could clean everyone out and buy a whole country with the winnings. Shantak thought it was just talk, so she started staring out the window. When she heard they were passing through Delamo, the city of clouds, Sue got super excited. She wanted to stop, but the Duke shut her down, not wanting to delay the carriage. He told her to come back on her own dime another time, and she called him a cheapskate again. Finally, after telling the driver to step on it, they arrived in Miramonte. The size and beauty of the Duke's mansion blew the girl away so much, she couldn't help but react. But Shantak coldly told Lady Marlene to get a grip. They were about to go inside the castle. Embracing like a real couple in love, they entered the estate. Inside, the servants and the butler were already waiting for them. The Duke was sure they'd heard about the guest from Ardell and told the butler to prepare a room for the lady. After Miramonte left, the man raised his head and studied the future duchess. Her posture was perfect. She held her back with proud straightness. Her step was light and graceful, like the sweep of a swan's wing, and her smile was simply gorgeous. Suddenly, the butler grabbed the lady's hands and began to thank her profusely. He said if his lord had remained a bachelor, he wouldn't have been able to pass on peacefully when his time came. After that, the butler escorted Lady Marlene to her room, which was right across from his lordship's. The guy figured it was way too soon to move in together, so he set up separate bedrooms. Honestly, the very thought of it freaked her out, so she just smiled and said everything was cool. Just then, maids came in to tell the lady the Duke wanted her prepped for an audience with His Majesty. They led her to the bathroom to help her clean up after the trip. She felt awkward stripping down in front of total strangers. While she was bathing, one of the maids noticed bruises and scars all over Lady Marlene's body. Sue just brushed it off, saying she was a wild kid growing up. The maid apologized for getting too personal with her questions. Obviously, she totally knew those marks were from some recent rough stuff. Realizing she needed to be more careful, Sue thanked the maids and told them she could handle the rest herself. So, the Duke had to wait a while, but the heroine was finally ready to go. When she came out of the room, he was pissed about her wasting his time. Turns out, Castello Baja was only a 5-minute carriage ride away. Miramonte was probably built so close to the royal castle on purpose, to quickly defend it if things went south. Just like Shantak said, they were at the royal palace in 5 minutes flat. The massive structure was imposing, even a little over the top. As they entered the throne room, the Duke put his arm lightly around her shoulders, and they wished each other luck. Standing before the king, Miramonte stepped forward and greeted him. The heroine stood with her head bowed, remembering Madame Keller's words about how nobles of lower rank mustn't look upon His Majesty's radiance. After exchanging a few pleasantries with the Duke, Javier asked him how things were in Ardell. Shantak filled me in on the southern front. Total disaster. Took 4 days just to get it back in fighting shape. But the king wasn't interested in military stuff. He just wanted to hear about the women of Ardell. Miramonte shut his mouth and looked away. The king jumped up like he'd just realized the rumors he'd heard were actually true. Sue tried to introduce herself, but he totally ignored her and kept talking to the Duke. The heroine realized His Majesty was deliberately blowing her off. Finding an opening, the girl finally introduced herself, saying her name was Marlene Sue Sinclair. He glanced at her and said she was all right looking, but definitely on the short side. And while Javier was really laying into her about her height, she was just confused about why he was acting like such a jerk. Finally, the Duke cut the king off and told him to keep his comments to himself about his future duchess. Javier was practically radiating how bored he was with Miramonte's whole song and dance. He declared he'd never, not for a single second, doubted Shantak. Even back when he was just a kid, it was clear he'd be Vilton's greatest hope. Shantak proved it, scoring a massive victory in the Bellium War. And there was only one reason the king might not trust him. A guy who's been through that much wouldn't just suddenly let a woman into his life like that. Javier understood it was his own stubbornness that made the Duke bring a bride from Ardell. The king would have been happy if he'd actually put in some effort, and Miramonte's blatant lies pissed him off. The Duke tried to argue, but Javier wasn't buying any of that true love crap. Besides, the king couldn't help but notice Shantak hadn't even reacted to the fact that he'd been deliberately ignoring the girl from the start. In his opinion, the Duke should have prepped better with this lady before scheming up this deception. Javier was having a hard time swallowing this story about some aristocrat's daughter hooking a whole country's duke. He knew damn well that Shantak could easily be playing her like a fiddle. Hearing the king was down on the Duke, our girl suddenly got an idea. His Majesty was just a regular guy, same as anyone, with his own feelings and whatnot, which meant he could be played too, if you pushed the right emotional buttons. Sue was a pro at faking it, and just seconds after the king spoke, she suddenly burst into tears. Javier and Shantak both spun around, totally surprised. When the king asked why she was crying, Marlene said her low status had dragged the duke through the mud. It bummed her out that His Majesty doubted their love, just because she wasn't some high society noble's kid. Bursting into even bigger tears, she begged forgiveness from her father, who dedicated his life to defending southern Villatan. The king jumped up, apologizing for the words that had so deeply wounded the lady. But Sue kept playing up the drama, saying she'd spent ages getting ready to appear before His Majesty and show him how happy she was. Glancing subtly, directly into Miramont's eyes, she gave him the signal. The Duke immediately understood what was needed, and in a flash, he was holding her, comforting her. Watching the scene unfold, the king announced that, perhaps, he would believe the lady. Shantak shot him such a scorching look that a shiver ran down Javier's spine. He suggested the lady take a little walk in the garden to calm down, while he and the Duke had a private word. His Majesty summoned a maid to escort Lady Marlene. After seating the girl on a bench in the garden, the maids offered a cold compress for her eyes, swollen from tears. However, the heroine politely refused and asked to just be left alone. Once everyone was gone, Sue blew her nose real hard, wondering why it always ran like a faucet whenever she faked crying. Suddenly, a guy's voice behind her asked why she was crying. She jumped, spinning around, trying to figure out who was talking to her. A handsome dude with golden hair and blue eyes stepped out from behind the trees. He held out a handkerchief, and she finally realized it was Prince Vilton. Back inside, alone with the Duke, the king said wearily that he was being pushed way too far. After Shantak apologized, Javier asked him why he'd brought that girl along. No matter how much Miramonte tried to convince him his relationship with Marlene was real, he didn't buy it, and gave him 3 reasons why. First, the Duke and that girl could be in cahoots, trying to trick him and pull a fast one. But seeing how genuinely Marlene was crying, the king dismissed that idea. Second, the Duke could be faking his feelings for that girl, just playing with her. It was a stretch, sure, but honestly, that seemed like the most likely scenario. The third option was that Shantak actually fell for her. But that was total BS to Javier, because he knew how much the Duke despised everyone. Miramonte shot back that His Majesty was way off base. Because it's not love or people he hates, it's himself. Javier looked at Shantak, shocked, and asked if he still hated him. But Shantak just coldly said he didn't, and never had. The king couldn't believe it, not after the way he treated him. Miramonte calmly replied that His Majesty just wanted to find a duchess for him. Javier started to argue, but the Duke cut him off hard. Shantak reminded His Majesty that they weren't brothers, and asked him not to expect things he couldn't deliver. And if it's about the Miramonte heir, he did have a kid he was planning to hand his holdings over to. The king wondered what would become of the Duke himself once he passed Miramonte onto that child. Javier was really worried about losing Shantak, and he wasn't hiding it. But the Duke had nothing to say to that, except to apologize. And after begging the king's pardon, he turned to leave. The heroine remembered Madame Keller's words about how you're supposed to greet a prince differently than the crown prince. But Sue had no clue who was standing in front of her, so she bowed and apologized. The girl confessed she didn't know who he was, and that cracked the prince up. He just couldn't stop laughing, and Sue couldn't figure out if she'd said something that funny. At one point, she even started to think she was dealing with a total nut job. So the dude finally blurts out, he's a prince, and apparently the crown prince has red hair, and he's never met anyone who got it wrong before. The heroine just smiles and admits she's not from around here, she's from Ardell. Turns out, the prince knows someone there named Lady Veronica. Judging by the girl's reaction, he figures they know each other, and Sue admits she knows her like, a little bit. After that, the prince goes right back to asking the stranger why she was crying. Trying to dodge the question, the heroine playfully tells His Highness it's not cool to pry into a lady's personal life. Right then, the prince just freezes up and stares at the girl, totally bug-eyed. His eyes go wide, he grabs her by the elbows and starts shaking her. But he's just rambling, and Sue can't make heads or tails of what's wrong with this guy. Just in time, the Duke shows up in the garden and pulls the prince off the heroine. Coming to his senses, His Highness apologizes to the lady and explains that she just reminded him of someone. The girl said she was fine, but couldn't help wondering why all these aristocrats were so incredibly weird. Miramont turned to Sue. just to double-check she was okay. The prince's expression shifted again, and he asked what kind of relationship the lady had with the duke. Shantak put his arm around her and said with a cutting smile that Lady Marlene was his future wife. Anger flashed in the prince's eyes again, but then he smiled and kissed the girl's hand goodbye. Once alone with the duke, Sue pointed out that they hadn't even greeted His Highness. She asked if they had a bad relationship, and Shantak dryly confirmed her guess before turning to leave. He made it totally clear he was tired and didn't want to talk. Lost in thought, Miramonte was walking so fast that the heroine could barely keep up. It was getting late, and they were still going somewhere, but Sue didn't even dare ask how much further they had to go. The duke finally stopped, and the heroine, looking up, realized they'd reached all the way to Miramonte Castle. Shantak was about to head into the estate, but Sue stopped him and asked where the carriage was. Even though the duke was sure the coachman would bring it, she reminded him the coachman was going to the market, and they were supposed to use the palace carriage. Sue was ticked off by Shantak, suggesting they could just grab the carriage later, because someone like her could easily just swipe it. She asked the duke for some cash so she could go back and get the carriage herself. Even though he didn't want to give in, she kept pushing, saying she'd give him a discount because he was a special customer. Knowing there was no point in arguing, Miramonte tossed her a few gold coins, and she immediately bolted back towards the castle. Watching Sue go, the duke just smiled. Back at the palace, the heroine already regretted running like that just for 3 gold coins. Suddenly, out of nowhere, the prince reappeared, saying he was waiting for a servant to come back for the carriage. Sue didn't get why His Highness needed to wait for a servant, but she just said she came back on her own to stretch her legs. The prince thought the duke shouldn't be giving a future duchess work like that, and he could use a lesson in manners. Then, he told the driver to take the carriage to the Miramonte Duchy. The heroine said goodbye and headed for the carriage to go back to the estate. But the prince suddenly grabbed her hand, stopping her dead in her tracks. He announced that he'd personally escort Lady Marlene back to the duchy. No matter how much she tried to refuse, the prince insisted, not wanting to miss a chance to stroll with her alone. The girl was blown away by the amazing view of the city at night. The prince told her how the first king called this place his beautiful Vaha when he first set foot on this land with the Duke of Miramonte. Then he just blurted out that Lady Marlene was way more beautiful. The heroine was floored. The prince was saying it again, and it was starting to sound a lot like flirting. She couldn't wrap her head around it. How could the prince of an entire country be so openly hitting on a future duchess? Holding her hand close to his chest, he confessed that if he could, he'd lock Marlene away in his palace, just so she'd only ever look at him. But the prince knew damn well that if he did that, the duke would be absolutely furious. Sue turned away, reminding him that she was already seeing someone. The prince laughed, claiming he was just kidding, because he could never possibly have those kinds of feelings for the future duchess. But even as he said that, his eyes were telling a completely different story. The prince suggested they keep moving, and she was once again convinced the guy was totally out of his mind. Just a few steps later, they were already at the Miramonte estate. The prince kissed her hand goodbye, and she told him to be careful on his journey. After finally ditching that psycho, the heroine stumbled into the estate, totally disgusted and shaking. Suddenly feeling completely drained, Sue collapsed right on the steps, ready to just pass out right there. Just then, the duke showed up on the staircase, wondering what the heck she was doing. The girl started complaining about how she'd had to trek all the way to Castello Castle and back, twice, already. And to make matters worse, one of those times she had to walk with that creepy prince. Sue indignantly explained how she got back to the castle, and he was just standing there like he had nothing better to do. Without a second thought, Shantak scooped the girl up under his arm and carried her up the stairs like a sack of potatoes. Suddenly, the heroine noticed a maid walking by. She whispered to the duke that no guy would ever haul a woman he cared about around like that. So, to avoid raising any eyebrows, in a flash, Shantak was carrying the girl to her room in his arms, like a true lover. As they walked past the maid, she just gasped, totally flustered. The heroine was blown away by how fast the duke thought on his feet and changed his tune. Remembering the meeting with the king, Sue couldn't help patting herself on the back for how smoothly she'd handled things. Suddenly, the girl was surprised to see a smile flicker across the duke's face for a split second. She couldn't resist bragging about how she'd made Lord Miramonte crack a smile, but he went right back to being serious and told her not to talk nonsense. The girl barely made it to her bedroom and changed before she was out like a light, totally exhausted. Meanwhile, a maid showed up at the Duke's study to inform His Grace that they'd found signs of abuse on the lady's body during her bath. Shantak listened to her with a blank expression and dismissed her. The heroine woke up feeling like everything around her was suddenly warm and humid. She opened her eyes in horror to find herself in the bathtub, a maid scrubbing her down with a loofah. Sue yelped, and the girl explained that Madam must have been so tired yesterday that she fell asleep without washing up. The heroine couldn't wrap her head around how someone could dunk a person in water without waking them. She jumped out of the tub and told the maid to get out. Sue really wanted to catch some more Z's, but it turned out she had to get ready to have breakfast with His Grace. So when she finally got dressed and went down to the dining room, she started nodding off right over her plate. Watching her, the Duke thought that his decision to send the servants away was probably the right call. He tried to wake her up, but she just dropped her silverware and kept sleeping, slumped back in her chair. The thought that no proper lady would fall asleep during a meal involuntarily made Shantak laugh. He hadn't expected that kind of reaction from himself, so he was surprised and thoughtful. Once the Duke finished eating, he walked over and put his hand on Sue's shoulder to wake her up. The girl immediately jumped up, pretending she hadn't been sleeping at all, and claiming she'd even had a good meal. Shantak suggested she go up to her room to get some proper rest and have the servants bring her dinner right up there. But the heroine didn't feel like sleeping anymore, and she asked the Duke for permission to see the city. Miramonte readily agreed, since in Vache, unlike Ardell, the girl didn't have any acquaintances she might run into. And even though Sue thought he'd go for a walk with her, the Duke stated he had a lot to do, and besides, she wasn't his friend. The girl laughed and didn't miss the chance to joke that she wasn't his friend, but his future wife. And even though Miramonte didn't go for a walk himself, he sent Fernando with the heroine. Sue wasn't exactly thrilled about this, of course, but the guy explained it was all for the lady's safety. Besides, the Duke is a very busy public servant, so it's hard for him to get away. Fernando said His Grace met a lady while he was on vacation. The heroine was surprised the local market wasn't as crazy loud as, say, Ardell. Fernando explained that in Miramonte's territory, you just don't have any hoodlums. That kind of confidence just made Sue laugh, because she knew better than anyone that there's no city without its dark side. As polished as the front looks, the back is going to be just as messed up. Suddenly, the heroine noticed a kid begging for money. He walked up to her and asked if she could spare a little something. A few minutes later, he was standing there, clutching a bag of fresh bread. The boy thanked her and promised he'd never forget her kindness. When asked why he wasn't eating the bread, he said he was going to share it with his little brothers and sisters. The heroine offered him water and told him to eat right then, promising to buy more for his family too. After stuffing his face and getting food for his family, the kid thanked the lady again. She asked him to hold out his hand, dumped some coins into it, and asked if 10 silver coins was enough to make a living in the capital. Then, Sue leaned in close to the boy and whispered for him to hand over the 10 silver pieces, but keep the rest for himself. Ruffling his hair in farewell, she told him to come to the Duke's castle if he ever got hungry again. When he asked who she was, the girl replied that the boy could find out if he came where she told him to. After the beggar left, Fernando asked Lady Marlene why she didn't just give the kid the money. After all, if he spent it carefully, he could stay fed for a whole week. The heroine explained that the money wouldn't have gone to the boy anyway, but to the people controlling those kids. That's why she suggested helping kids like that with food, but also giving them a few coins, because if they don't make their daily quota, they'll get a beating. Fernando was floored. How could a lady know stuff like that? Sue, dodging the question, just gave him grief for not knowing common knowledge. After a short walk around town, she told Fernando she was really digging the place, but just as she was about to head down another alley, she froze, and her good mood vanished in a heartbeat. Sue spun around and started hustling in the opposite direction. Fernando chased after her, trying to figure out what was up and why she suddenly looked like she'd seen a ghost. She hadn't gotten far when she heard a familiar voice behind her. The prince. Trying not to show how bummed she was to see him, Sue turned around and forced a smile at His Highness. While the prince was going on about how happy he was to see her, she was racking her brain trying to figure out how he'd managed to find her way out here. When Fernando started introducing himself to His Highness, she remembered he was there and breathed a sigh of relief. The heroine was sure the prince wouldn't do anything reckless with the knight protecting her. But before she could even finish the thought, He wound up and smacked Fernando right across the face. Furious at his nerve, the girl rushed to the knight, while the prince, acting like nothing happened, asked if she'd had dinner yet. Ignoring his question, Marlene demanded to know how he dared hit the Duke's knight. But the prince, paying her no mind, suddenly walked up to her, grabbed her arm, and started talking about dinner again. He dragged the heroine along, insisting they needed to head to a restaurant right now. And even though the prince looked completely out of his mind at that moment, he kept repeating that everything was fine. The heroine decided to appeal to his reason, saying the Duke would worry if she didn't return to the estate. But the prince didn't even seem to hear her, and kept offering her a dinner of Ardelian cuisine. Her attempts to get through to him completely crashed and burned, and the heroine had no choice but to follow this lunatic. All she hoped for on the way was that Fernando would snap out of it and go after the Duke ASAP. When they walked into the restaurant, the prince was still gripping her wrist so tight, she actually groaned. He turned around like he was just realizing he was hurting her. The prince let go of Lady Marlene and apologized, saying he wasn't really in control of his own strength. Only after they sat down at the table, Arthur Magova, Charles Clement Villemain, formally introduced himself to the girl, but he asked her to just call him Arthur. The heroine pointed out that the Duke was probably freaking out because she hadn't come back yet. Not wanting to hear a word about Shantak, the prince told her to eat while the food was still hot. After taking a sip of water, Sue wondered why this guy kept blowing off everything she said. Without taking his eyes off her, Arthur asked why she wasn't eating anything. The girl smiled and explained that she'd actually already had steak for breakfast with the Duke. In that instant, the prince grabbed a plate off the table and hurled it straight through the window, shattering the glass. And while he was ordering a restaurant employee to bring something the girl would like, she regretted not just eating in silence to begin with. So, when the waiter brought a new dish, she tried her best to act like she loved it. She was laying it on so thick that Arthur suddenly noticed her insincerity. Looking a little flustered, he asked the girl if she was scared. Nervously rubbing the back of his neck, the prince repeated that he has trouble keeping his cool. Marlene tried to assure His Highness that everything was fine, but as if he hadn't heard a word she said, he asked her to call him Arthur. Once the misunderstanding was cleared up and the girl started eating, the prince stared at her, never looking away. And when he suddenly declared that she was beautiful even when she eats, the heroine actually choked. He offered Marlene a handkerchief, but all she wanted in that moment was for him to just let her go. Then, out of nowhere, Arthur asked how she and Sir Shantak had met. She gave him the practice story about first seeing the Duke when he was inspecting the southern front, then accidentally bumping into him in Ardel's pleasure district and falling in love. After listening to her, the prince's face suddenly darkened. His hand clenched into a fist, and his whole body started to tremble with nervous energy. Feeling himself losing control to the anger surging through him again, Arthur tried to calm himself, squeezing one hand with the other. Finally, he managed to force a kind of smile, which did absolutely nothing to convince Sue that he was okay. And then the prince announced that he never thought the Duke was capable of loving anyone. The girl suddenly jumped up from the table, noticing bloody marks imprinted on His Highness's glove. Taking off the glove, Arthur smiled and said that everything was fine. He says it's the best way to keep his cool when he needs to, so the lady's got nothing to worry about. He was really touched that Marlene was so concerned about the guy who dragged her to the restaurant. Then, blushing like crazy, he confessed to her that he was totally head over heels. Grabbing her hand, Arthur asked her what he was supposed to do now. She knew the prince was only 19, but she couldn't just excuse his reckless behavior because of his age. Just then, the Duke showed up next to their table and silently pulled the prince's hand away from hers. Arthur smirked, saying Shantak sure got here quick. Giving the prince a stern look, the Duke asked if he'd forgotten what he'd told him. Shantak said he had no idea what His Highness saw in this girl, but whatever it was none of his business. Saying that this lady would be his wife, the Duke grabbed her hand and pulled her close. He added, as a final word, that Arcturus should cut the crap. The prince, cool as a cucumber, reminded the Duke that he and Lady Marlene weren't married yet. Besides, in his opinion, Shantak wasn't exactly the type to treat a woman right. Barely holding it together, the Duke told Magova to watch her mouth. Miramonte asked him not to push it, reminding him that the only person he swore loyalty to was His Majesty. With that, he turned and headed for the restaurant exit. The heroine turned and glanced at the prince, whose face was troubled once more. Catching her eye, Arcturus grinned and waved at the girl with his bloodied hand. Once outside, Sue asked the Duke how he knew where to find her. Shantak pointed out it was Miramonte's territory, and there was no reason he couldn't track her down here. The heroine asked if he was mad at her for not returning to the estate and going to dinner with the prince instead. But the Duke saw no reason to be angry with her, because he knew perfectly well that the prince's grip was like a freaking vice. And if Arcturus decided to bulldoze his way through, there's no stopping him. Speaking of that kind of strength, Shantak was referring to the giants from the kingdom of Bellium, who were as tall as trees. Sue confirmed that the prince really did have the strength of an ox and showed him the bruise he'd left on her arm. Miramonte took the girl's hand and started rubbing it. The heroine was worried that she might be mistaken for a troublemaker at tomorrow's ball if the bruise was noticed. However, Shantak declared that wouldn't happen and kept rubbing her hand. In literally a minute, there wasn't a trace of the bruise left on Sue's skin. The heroine couldn't believe her eyes, but the Duke explained that he'd simply hidden it from view, and it would still hurt. Remembering the maid's words, Shantak asked if there were bruises anywhere else. Getting a negative reply, he turned and continued on his way home. The heroine admitted she was impressed by how the Duke handled His Highness, who she thought was totally off his rocker. She figured Shantak had known the prince since childhood, since he called him by his childhood nickname, Magova. The Duke suddenly smiled and said that Sue seemed to be completely fearless. After all, she wasn't even scared after witnessing Arcturus's, let's just say, unpleasantness. However, the heroine didn't know what she had to be afraid of, if she hadn't done anything wrong. According to Shantak, the prince has trouble controlling himself, and he avoids people and usually doesn't leave the palace, so today was a bit of a surprise. He advised the girl to be careful around Arcturus regardless, since even His Majesty can't keep him in check. When the heroine went to visit Fernando, she found him covered in bruises. The guy scrambled out of bed, grabbing his dagger and apologizing to the lady. To make up for failing to protect Lady Marlene, Fernando was ready to give up an arm. The heroine gasped, knocking the weapon out of his hand, saying she didn't need his arm. She explained she just came to check on him, and Fernando breathed a sigh of relief. The guy was glad Lady Marlene didn't like the idea, because he really didn't want to do it, even if it was the Duke's order. The heroine cut him off, asking why he was covered in bruises if the prince only hit him in the face once. Fernando went silent, trying to think of an excuse. Truth was, when he'd burst into the Duke's office to report the prince's kidnapping of Lady Marlene, the Duke reminded him he'd promised to beat him within an inch of his life if he screwed up again. Fernando couldn't think of anything better than to tell the lady he was fine. And she figured he'd been jumped by some thugs, and being a knight, was just embarrassed about it. The Duke's welcome back ball was tomorrow, and our girl had to pick an outfit. Sue grabbed the first dress she saw, but the maid suggested she try on a few more. She explained that a girl who'd come from the sticks like her probably wasn't used to royal balls. But since this was a ball for His Grace, the lady needed to, match his status as his partner. The heroine thought the maid was implying she'd embarrass the Duke, but she didn't let it get to her. Sue decided to show everyone what she was made of. Cool as a cucumber, she thanked the maid for her concern and pointed out that for her debut as future Duchess, she had to look amazing. The other maids jumped on board, because according to them, Lady Lanfranchi would be at the ball. The heroine had no clue who that was, so she asked them to explain. Turns out they were talking about Duke Lanfranchi's daughter, who was super gorgeous and had a major thing for His Grace. When Marlene started trying on the dresses, she was so skinny they practically hung off her. She grabbed some socks off the floor and stuffed them in her bra to, fill things out a little. The maids cracked up. They thought she was hilarious and a total natural. But then, for some reason, one of them just collapsed on the floor and started bawling. She couldn't handle the fact that even this skinny lady, with dresses sliding right off her, was going to be His Grace's bride. The other maids dragged her away, stuffing a rag in her mouth, while she screamed about how she'd look way better in those outfits. After what felt like forever, the preparations were finally done, and Lady Marlene was ready for the ball. But she wasn't feeling any of the compliments, because she knew it was all just a facade. It wasn't really her shining that day. It was Marlene Sue Sinclair, the part she was playing. If there was anyone whose shine was real, it was Duke Miramonte. He was the kind of guy who just radiated charisma, no matter what he was wearing or where he was. Shantak told the girl she looked especially beautiful that night, and he said it with a grace you just don't find in someone from the slums. But hey, Sue had something the aristocrats didn't, so she wasn't sweating it. On the way to the carriage, the girl asked the Duke what time the ball usually wrapped up. You can imagine her surprise when she found out the royal ball went on for 3 days and 3 nights. But Shantak promised they'd just make an appearance for His Majesty and then bail. As Sue was climbing into the carriage, the Duke suddenly froze and stared at her, eyes wide. The next thing you know, he's got this angry look on his face, grabs her hand, and starts pulling her towards him without saying a word. Shantak was shocked when he pulled a pair of socks, all wadded up, out of Sue's corset. The girl went red, started shaking, and began yelling. Whether from embarrassment or outrage that he was accusing her of sock pilfering, once they were in the carriage, the girl noticed the Duke was barely holding back laughter, so she grumbled that he could go ahead and laugh if he really wanted to. Getting her okay, Shantak burst out in loud, cheerful laughter. Glaring at him, the heroine wondered since when he'd suddenly started smiling and laughing so much. When Duke Miramonte and his fiancée entered the ballroom, all eyes were glued to them. The ladies were whispering about Shantak's unbelievable good looks. The heroine whispered, asking what kind of payback she'd get if these ladies decided to jump her. Marquis Durand came out to greet them, looking super happy to see the Duke. Suddenly, the guy's gaze shifted to Sue, and it turned out he recognized her. The heroine lowered her head as the Marquis expressed his honest surprise that she was some kind of high society. Finally, the girl gathered her thoughts, smiled, and greeted Uncle Hugo. The Marquise was genuinely happy to see the girl looking so well. The Duke whispered to Sue, asking how they knew each other, and it turned out Durand had once been her target. About 3 years ago, the soft-hearted Marquis gave the girl a whole bag of gold just because she coughed up blood near him, and apparently, he still hasn't figured out he got played. Durand was pleased to learn that Sue was the same girl from Ardell everyone in the capital was now talking about. He inquired whether the girl had recovered from that rare illness that prevented her from leaving the city back then. The heroine snuggled up to the Duke and declared that she was healed by the power of love. According to her, she couldn't leave Ardell back then, not only because of the illness, but also because of fear. But her love for Shantak proved stronger. The good-natured Marcoux was incredibly touched by this heartwarming story. When Durand walked away, Miramonte remarked that Sue should be grateful he has such a personality. Suddenly, a red-haired woman approached them, and after greeting the Duke, she chided him for not even sending her a word after returning from Ardell. As soon as she realized it was Lady Lanfranchi, the heroine remembered what the maid had said about her. The woman claimed she'd already heard about the Duke of Ardell's friend, but he introduced Lady Marlene as his future wife. Lady Lanfranchi frowned, making it clear she thought she was the one he'd be marrying. The Duke suggested they step aside for a private word. He asked Marlene to wait a moment and promised he'd be right back. Once they were in a more secluded spot, Miramonte told Lady Lanfranchi to stop acting so out of line. She reminded him that they had history, and that to do the right thing by this child, he needed to marry her. But the Duke didn't see that as a reason to tie the knot. The child was getting everything they needed from the dukedom, and Shantak promised he would continue to grow up wanting for nothing. So, he strongly advised Lady Lanfranchi not to try and get what she wanted by hiding behind responsibility. The whole time, the heroine was eavesdropping from around the corner, even though she couldn't make heads or tails of what they were talking about. Meanwhile, Shantak asked Lady Lanfranchi not to make a scene on Marlene's debut as the future Duchess. The heroine decided to cut this awkwardness short, ran up to the Duke, grabbed his arm, and suggested a dance. She said with a smile that it was a pleasure to meet her and wished Lady Lanfranchi a good time. Before the woman could even process what was happening, Sue whisked a stunned Shantak away. As they started dancing, the heroine smirked and suggested the Duke thank her for the assist. Finally snapping out of it, Miramonte smiled and spun the girl more energetically in the dance. Sue was impressed by his skills and asked if there was anything in this life he wasn't good at. And even though the Duke admitted there was something like that, he stopped short of saying what it was. The girl didn't press him, because if she were in his shoes, she wouldn't reveal her weaknesses either. King Javier entered the hall, his gaze immediately locking onto the dancing couple. He approached them and asked Lady Marlene if she was enjoying her time in the capital. The heroine wanted to tell him he should keep a better eye on his son, but instead, she just said everything was wonderful. After a short pause, the king suddenly announced he was very happy the Duke had finally decided to get married. However, he worried that Shantak only brought this lady here so he could ditch her right after the wedding. Clinging to Miramonte, the heroine cried out and begged His Majesty not to say such things. She said that she and the Duke loved each other, and those kinds of words hurt her deeply. The problem, however, was that Javier believed the lady, which he couldn't say about Shantek himself. Still, he didn't want to seem like a total jerk by continuing to push the issue. So, he wished the couple a good time at the ball, and added that he was eagerly looking forward to their wedding. Once Javier was gone, the heroine asked if his words could be taken as a marriage proposal, and the Duke replied that it seemed that way. Inside, the girl was ecstatic, because it meant she'd get her payout soon. After standing around for a bit, Sue realized she was starving. Shantak suggested she head to the garden, where tables were set up, and grab a bite while he finished his chat with His Majesty. The heroine took his advice and went outside to find some snacks. She barely reached for a plate when someone suddenly offered her one. Sue recognized the voice and, turning around, saw Arcturus. His face lit up with a happy smile. It occurred to her that she needed to go where there were more people, so the prince wouldn't do something crazy again. But when she suggested they go back to the ballroom, he said that too many people made him uncomfortable. Laughing nervously, Sue declared that she needed to go back to show off her dance moves and headed towards the castle. But Arcturus caught up to her, grabbed her wrist, and asked if she was avoiding him. The girl tried to tell His Highness that wasn't the case at all, but he, like he wasn't even listening, asked her to call him by his name. He grabbed Lady Marlene by the shoulders and asked what she was so afraid of. Staring at her with those wild blue eyes, the prince insisted he wasn't going to hurt her. Suddenly, he spun around and, dragging the girl along, started leading her somewhere. Sue was overflowing with anger at the prince, who was acting like he owned the place, and she kicked him away from her. But Arcturus just calmly blocked her kick and grabbed her leg. The next thing she knew, he threw the girl over his shoulder, saying he needed to show her something. No matter how much she struggled, the prince wouldn't let go and told her to chill out, promising they didn't have far to go. Sue didn't even notice when one of her shoes fell off along the way. By the time they reached the spot, the sun had dipped below the horizon, and the woods were getting dark. When she asked why she couldn't walk herself, Arcturus just said she was missing a shoe. Finally, the prince set her down, and when she turned around, she saw this unbelievably beautiful tree glowing in the dark at the edge of the woods. To Marlene's surprise, Arcturus told her it was Cynthia. The heroine never imagined that the divine tree from ancient legends was actually real. And yet, there it was, right in front of her. She was seeing it with her own eyes, and she couldn't take her eyes off its beauty. The look on the prince's face showed how happy he was to share something he loved with her. He was just stoked that Marlene liked it too, like a little kid showing off his favorite toy. Come to think of it, the prince was practically Mel's age, and the heroine, figuring she had nothing to fear from a 19-year-old kid, plopped down on the ground. Grinning, she said that if he carried her all the way out here just to show her this, he could have just used his words so she wouldn't freak out. Arcturus got flustered and admitted he was just in a real hurry. He stood up and suddenly announced that Lady Marlene looked a lot like the spirit of this tree. The girl was surprised by his words, thinking he should be past believing in spirits at 19. Seeing from her face that she didn't believe him, Arcturus walked over to the tree and touched its trunk. The trunk opened up, and in the middle appeared the tree spirit, who really did look a lot like her. Sue jumped up, her jaw dropping in surprise, and the prince explained that this was Cynthia. She was a treasure of the royal family, kept safe for 1,000 years. And since the spirit only showed its face to the master of Cynthia Palace, even His Majesty couldn't see it. When Arcturus was little, she had her eyes open, but one day, for some reason, she closed them. Based on the fact that Lady Marlene was able to see Cynthia, unlike others, the prince concluded that she was somehow connected to the spirit. It was said that in very ancient times, this spirit used to walk and talk, so Arcturus figured Cynthia might have descendants. The heroine smirked at the thought of a con artist being descended from a divine spirit. The prince explained that's why he was so surprised the day he first met Marlene, though now, seeing her and Cynthia side by side, he could see they were a little different. Realizing Arcturus was so obsessed with her because of the fairy, the heroine burst out laughing, but she stopped laughing a couple seconds later when the prince suddenly blurted out his idea. He thought that if Lady Marlene inherited the spirit's blood, maybe Cynthia would wake up if they sprinkled some of the girl's blood on this spot. And even though Arcturus laughed and said he was just kidding, it sounded pretty messed up. Even though the heroine didn't see any resemblance between herself and the spirit, The prince insisted they were very similar, because he loved Cynthia more than anyone and couldn't be wrong. He walked up to the tree and hugged it tight to show that it wasn't breaking, even though it looked fragile. And at that moment, Marlene's shoe came flying straight into the prince's head. The Duke was right behind them, absolutely livid. Convinced Magova was practically begging for a dirt nap. He grabbed Sue's arm, furious that she apparently couldn't be left alone for even a second. Arcturus, on the other hand, was pissed that Shantak had followed them without asking. But he ignored him, accusing the prince of being so smitten with some tree that he was making moves on the Duke's woman. Not wanting to hear any more of it, Arcturus drew his sword and pointed it at Miramonte. Sue shrieked and begged him to put the weapon away, because a thin trickle of blood was running down Shantak's neck. But he just stood there, stone-faced. It wasn't exactly news to the prince that the Duke didn't give a damn about his own hide. Guess that's why His Majesty was so worried. Because even Shantak's eyes were totally lifeless. Arcturus was outraged that the king of an entire country had to debase himself just to keep a guy like that alive. And even though his father trusted the Duke, the prince himself doubted that someone who didn't value his own life would actually want a woman. Shantak waved Magova's sword away, saying he was talking total garbage. Out of all his subjects, His Majesty trusts him the least. But that doesn't change the fact that he chose Marlene for himself. With that, the Duke pulled her close and forbade Arcturus from even coming near his wife from that day on. Shantak had already tolerated his insolence twice, and he wasn't about to do it a third time, so he advised the prince to watch himself. After walking only a short distance, the heroine realized she'd left her shoes by the tree, and it hurt to walk. But Miramonte acted like he didn't hear her complaints and kept walking ahead without stopping. Sue got pissed at his rude behavior and reminded him that he was here for her. Just then, she suddenly heard some weird rustling in the bushes. Turning around, the heroine froze in terror, seeing a ferocious tiger charging toward her. Sue couldn't believe that beasts like that could be in the royal forest. Figuring the king wouldn't let any animal that could hurt his kids hang out in the woods, she figured it was just a well-trained pet tiger. The girl smiled and reached out to the beast, wanting to say hello, but the beast took a running start and leaped right at the girl, jaws wide open. The heroine squeezed her eyes shut and covered her face, figuring this was it. But the attack didn't happen for some reason, and Sue hesitantly opened one eye, then the other. The Duke was standing there, and the tiger had its fangs sunk into his arm. The arm he'd used to shield the girl, as it turned out. Shantak's eyes flashed with anger, and he coldly and sharply ordered the animal to sit. The tiger, looking pitiful, let go of his arm and obediently sat down on the ground, like a little puppy. The heroine stared in disbelief as, at the Duke's command, the ferocious beast tucked its tail and returned to where it came from. In response to her confusion, Shantak explained that it was His Majesty's pet tiger. Sue started complaining that the beast clearly hadn't been trained properly, and then suddenly screamed again. She saw blood seeping through the Duke's jacket from a wound left by the tiger's fangs. The girl rushed to Shantak, insisting that he needed to see a doctor right away. She sat him down on a big boulder so she could give him first aid herself. Frowning intently, Sue told the Duke to get his clothes off, pronto. While he was taking off his doublet, the girl was wondering what she could use as a bandage. When Sue turned back to Shantak, she was surprised by the sheer number of scars all over his body. But the Duke explained that anyone who's been on the battlefield has scars like these, and there's nothing to worry about, because everything heals eventually. Nevertheless, the heroine pointed out that getting bitten by an animal was a whole different ballgame. With her teeth, she tore a piece of fabric from the hem of her dress to bandage the wound. Lost in thought and looking kinda pissed, the girl silently gave Shantak first aid. He broke the silence, confused why she was taking it so seriously. After all, he knew she had scars of her own. The heroine stood up straight, and you could see a big bruise on her exposed leg from the impact. The girl quickly composed herself, smiled, and asked if he'd heard about it from the maid who helped her bathe. The Duke offered to fire the maid if Sue felt uncomfortable because of it. But the heroine saw no reason to fire someone just for doing their job. And besides, she wasn't ashamed of the scars, which were proof of her life. When the Duke and his fiancée returned to the castle, the king almost fainted at the sight of them. But when Marlene explained how Shantak had jumped to protect her, he was a little surprised, then made a weird request. Javier stated that Miramonte was a pretty volatile guy and asked the young lady to take good care of him. As the heroine rode home in her carriage, she remembered the prince's words. which she hadn't understood at first. But now, Arcturus's comment about Shantak having no attachment to life seemed to be making sense in her mind. The Duke's scars weren't just wounds from the battlefield, but more like the scars of someone trying to self-destruct. The heroine used to think that everyone valued their own life. Even she, who grew up in dirty alleys, cherished every moment she lived. The Duke interrupted her thoughts, suddenly announcing that their wedding would be next week. When Sue learned that everything was happening so fast, she panicked. Shantak was genuinely confused about what the problem was, since the wedding was fake. But she reminded him that it had to look real to everyone else. He reassured her, saying it would be a small ceremony within the territory, and the important thing was that the king be there. His Majesty knew perfectly well how much Miramonte hated a fuss, so he wouldn't read too much into it. So, the heroine wanted to know if Shantak would get the title as soon as they tied the knot. But the guy said no way, since even he didn't know when that would actually happen. That pissed off Sue, who wasn't planning on sticking around in Vash for more than a year. She jumped on Shantak, saying over and over that she had her own life and needed to get back to her brother. But Miramonte promised it wouldn't take long, since His Majesty wasn't one to hold on to suspicions for long. The girl bought it and asked what would happen to her when he finally got what he was after. According to Shantak, Marlene Sue Sinclair would either vanish, kick the bucket, or ditch him, and Miramonte's mission would be accomplished when he passed the Duke title to that kid. Sue figured the king might get suspicious if Shantak handed over the title the second he got it. But turns out, once a Duke title is locked in, it can't be taken back unless you commit a major crime, like treason. It blew the heroine away how cold-blooded Miramonte was talking about this, like he didn't give a damn about the king's feelings. But none of that was her problem anymore, and she'd be saying goodbye to the Marlene act pretty soon. The girl dreamed of getting away to some little village when it was all over, and finally chilling out for once. Somewhere so off the map, no noble from Vahia would ever think to visit. Thinking about that, the heroine suddenly realized the Duke was planning to ditch his position. She laughed and told Shantak he could join her as a con artist if he was bored. Time was flying, and the Duke was getting noticeably busier with the wedding prep. Sue was surprised he wasn't freaking out at all. And even though Miramonte reminded her it was just a marriage contract, she figured that didn't make it not a marriage. She kept bugging him, guessing he was working overtime on purpose to avoid getting bummed out about the wedding. Shantak told Sue she was useless and just getting in the way, then kicked her to the curb. A maid walked by and gave Marlene this weird smile that just made her even more freaked out. The girl snatched a basket of bread from the maid's cart and headed to the window, wanting to chill out and grab a bite. Back in the carriage, the Duke was talking like he was going to bolt the second he got his official title. Sue tried to tell herself that once their deal was done, none of this would be her problem anymore. Suddenly, someone chucked a pebble at the window, and when she looked out, she saw Django, that alley kid who begs for money. Grabbing the curtain, she hopped right out the window and was next to him on the street in a heartbeat. When the kid looked surprised, Sue just said she used to do a little acrobatics. The kid didn't really buy that nobles did stuff like that, but she cut him off and asked about the job she gave him. The beggar pulled a letter from Mel out of his pocket and handed it to her. My bro wrote that he was really worried about Sue, 'cause she's never been totally straight with him, and he hoped she was doing okay. He was doing all right at the Royal Academy. His real rank wasn't exposed, though showing up late meant he had to deal with some hazing. But Mel quickly shut down anyone trying to act tough just because of their family name. He told his sis not to worry about him and to write him as often as she could. The heroine thought it was sweet how Mel kept telling her to eat well at the end of the letter. She ruffled the messenger's hair and thanked him for delivering it. Then the girl gave Django some gold and said she'd be counting on him from now on. When asked how he was doing, the beggar said it was the same old thing. The teens are jerks and the adults are cheap. Learning he was 10, Sue told him to hang in there for 5 more years, 'cause then he'd be considered an adult and life wouldn't be so dangerous. She gave the kid some bread to eat before he left, so he'd grow up faster. Without even batting an eye, he mumbled that he was actually going to ask her for a little something. The heroine was amused by how confident he was acting in the Duke's mansion, even though he'd only been here a couple of times. After seeing the boy off, Sue strolled through the garden, wondering when she'd get her next letter from Mel. Suddenly, her attention was drawn to a gold coin lying in the grass, and then another and another. Gathering the coins, the heroine didn't even notice how she ended up near the bushes. And then, all of a sudden, Arcturus jumped out from there with a huge grin on his face. The girl tried to put on the friendliest expression she could and asked how he got there. The prince told her to keep it down, since he'd snuck onto the estate grounds. The heroine was about to call for the guards, but Arcturus shook a bag of gold in front of her, and she immediately shut her mouth. The prince laughed, satisfied that the intel about how much Marlene loved money was spot on. He heard it from Lady Veronica, and Sue was ready to kill that snake for it. Arthur dangled the pouch in front of her again, promising it in exchange for a little favor. He said it was simple. Marlene just needed to change her clothes. The heroine, who thought this was a little off, politely declined his offer. But the prince, with that crazy look in his eyes, couldn't understand why she wouldn't. Sue got spooked, so she decided to give a little and at least ask what kind of clothes he was talking about. Arthur said she'd definitely like it and pulled a long white dress out of his bag. The girl flat out refused, not wanting to dress up like a little kid. The prince was bummed, 'cause he really wanted to see Marlene in that dress. Seeing him so down, the heroine scoffed and asked how much he was going to pay her for it. When she found out there were 300 gold coins in the bag, she agreed to change if he doubled the amount. Arcturus laughed, since he was actually planning to pay 700 gold coins from the start. The heroine asked him to wait a bit and ran off to put on the dress. The prince waited patiently for so long that the sun had already begun to set. Sue finally changed. The fabric was surprisingly nice, though the fairy wings were a little embarrassing. As she walked back to Arcturus, the heroine wondered if she should even show herself to him. After all, she said she'd put on the dress, but she never promised to show how it looked. The girl even considered just going back to the estate and going to sleep in the outfit, which would be perfect as pajamas. But suddenly, someone greeted her from behind. The heroine turned around and saw a boy with bright red hair in front of her. Judging by the expensive clothes, he couldn't be a servant's kid. Sue figured the boy was probably just visiting the Duke. She greeted the kid with a smile. He was checking out her outfit and kinda reminded her of Shantak himself. The boy was totally mesmerized by Sue, like she was some kind of magical fairy, so she crouched down in front of him and played along with his idea. Turns out the kid, who was freaking out about meeting a real fairy, was named Beau. And even though he had a full name, way longer than that, he wanted to be called that by his new friend. Just then, Duke Miramonte walked up, called out to the boy, and smiled, beckoning him over. Beau ran to Shantak and started hugging him. Shantak suggested they go inside the estate to get out of the cold. Then he turned to Sue and invited her to join them, since the sun was almost down. As she stood up, doing as she was told, she wondered if Beau was the Duke's son. That could totally be the case. Shantak wasn't exactly a spring chicken, and he could easily have a 6-year-old kid. Maybe he's the one the Duke was talking about back in the carriage. Honestly, she knew it shouldn't even bother her. Their contract didn't say anything about Miramonte having to give her a family update. Sue felt the air get seriously chilly and figured it was a good time to head back to the estate. Suddenly, it felt like she was forgetting something, but since she couldn't remember what, she figured it couldn't be that important. Meanwhile, the prince was freezing his butt off from the cold wind, sneezing while he waited in the bushes for her to come back. In the morning, she was lying in bed, wondering why the Duke needed a fake marriage if he already had a kid who, obviously, should have a mom. Those thoughts were interrupted by an older woman who walked into the room. She introduced herself as Helen and said she took care of young Master Beau, but from now until the wedding, she'd be assisting Lady Marlene. The heroine figured she was probably replacing that maid who threw a fit and got canned last time. Sue was actually kinda relieved, 'cause Helen was way cooler anyway. It finally clicked for her. Beau wasn't just living in the duchy, he was the heir to Miramont. Helen looked the lady up and down and thought her outfit was pretty wild. The main character, who'd totally spaced on it, just said it was a pajama thing. Then, Helen offered to help the lady out with her schedule for the day. They had a wedding dress fitting to get to. A couple minutes later, the main character was standing in the dress, and the maids were already going back and forth about where to add lace and bling. Out of nowhere, Beau and Arcturus showed up in the room too, and started giving their 2 cents about the dress. They both agreed that a sorceress-style wedding dress would suit her way better. The main character was floored to see the prince in the room, but he insisted he wasn't a prince, just an adventurer passing through. Sue ripped into him for barging onto the estate again, and then trying to push his crazy ideas onto her wedding dress. Since they were on the subject, Arcturus reminded her that he'd paid her, and she still hadn't done what he asked. Hearing that, Bo was super surprised that a fairy wouldn't keep her promises. The prince was about to tell the kid about the 700 gold pieces he paid this fairy, but she clapped a hand over his mouth and suggested they continue this outside. Once outside, she demanded Arcturus tell her the real reason he kept following her around. But all he did was ask if she was really going through with marrying the Duke. He even offered to help her if she wanted to pull off some kind of romantic getaway from the wedding. Sue laughed and told him not to talk nonsense, which clearly bummed Arcturus out. He claimed the Duke wasn't capable of love and couldn't take responsibility for the people around him. She angrily told the prince not to say stuff like that, insisting that Shantak had always been super considerate to her. Arcturus cut her off, saying he felt that way because the boy, Bo's mother, died because of the Duke. The prince couldn't get into the nitty-gritty about the incident itself, but he could tell Sue about the woman. Bo's mother, Camilla, taught Arcturus etiquette, and she was a strong and beautiful woman. Years ago, on a bright summer day, the royal gardener was working in the garden. The prince, who even back then couldn't control his own strength, ran into the yard and, barely touching a tree, snapped its trunk. Seeing this, the gardener was speechless. The boy ran up to the frightened man and asked him to play. Arcturus flicked his hand slightly and knocked the garden shears out of his hands, sending them flying and breaking in half. The gardener fell to the ground and begged His Highness to spare his life. Soon, rumors spread among the aristocrats that the prince, born to a captured Pentanta princess who took her own life, hadn't learned to control the powers of his tribe. Anything he touched turned to dust and rubble, even the royal treasures. Rumor had it the kid practically bankrupted the palace. When Arthur hugged his nanny, he accidentally snapped her neck. They called the boy a real monster, said he offed so many maids you couldn't even keep count. After hearing what people said about him, Arthur spent his days alone, reading books in his castle. But one day, Camilla came to him and announced she'd be teaching him manners. The boy was pretty wary of the teacher, but without waiting for an invite, she walked right in and sat down across from him. Slouching in the chair, Camilla suggested Arthur skip the first day of lessons since she wasn't feeling it. The boy was surprised she was talking to him so casually. Camilla, for her part, didn't see any reason why she should be formal with a kid 11 years younger than her. The prince was blown away by how she talked to him without any hesitation, while everyone else was scared and avoided him. He told the girl how incredibly lonely it made him feel. Camilla explained that it was a natural reaction to him, making things difficult with his incredible strength. She suggested Arcturus come with her so she could show him something amazing. The girl led him to a Cynthia tree that glowed in the dark. She shared a royal secret, that no force could ever break that tree. When the boy asked how she knew royal secrets, Camilla just said it was another secret. Then she told Arcturus to come over to the tree and give it a hug. The boy walked hesitantly to the Cynthia tree, touched it, embraced it, and a happy smile lit up his face. Finishing his story, the prince advised Sue to really think things over before getting married. He kissed her hand and told her to let him know if she changed her mind about marrying the Duke. When the heroine got back to the estate, Helen told her that His Grace wanted to see her in his study after the fitting. Sue asked Bo to come with her, and he happily agreed. On the way to the study, Shanta's head was filled with the prince's words. The thought that this boy's mother might have died because of the Duke made her uneasy. Sue was trying to figure out if Arcturus was telling the truth, or if it was all just a jealous fabrication about Shanta. But come to think of it, there were always weird rumors about the Duke, even that he supposedly offed his own brother. Still, Miramonte didn't seem like some cold-blooded monster. And besides, he was planning on leaving the duchy. Suddenly, Bo called Sue sis and gave her a sweet smile. His innocent smile made her think that he and the Duke had a good relationship, and kids can't fake their feelings. They'd finally reached the office when the kid suddenly decided to ask Sue a question. He wanted to know why she wasn't wearing her magical fairy outfit today. She explained to Bo that it was for special occasions, and made him promise to keep her fairy status a secret. Just then, the Duke's voice boomed from behind the door, wondering why they were still hanging around outside. Stepping into the office, Sue whispered to Bo that they needed to keep their little secret under wraps. But the kid suddenly stepped forward, shielding her, and declared to the Duke that this lady was definitely not a fairy. The Duke agreed with Bo, then told Marlene to come over to him. She was ticked off that he was ordering her around like some kind of pet. Shantak chuckled and said he was just treating her like his wife. As she approached, he held out some papers detailing the wedding schedule and etiquette. Sue was in total shock when she found out the wedding was happening in just 3 days. Even though she was super pissed he hadn't told her sooner, she still grabbed the papers to check them out. The girl stormed out of the office, practically shaking with rage, and Bo suddenly took off after her. He stopped Sue, told her not to be mad, and held out a fancy-looking hairpin. It was the same piece of jewelry she'd tried to swipe on her way to the duchy, but Shantak caught her. When she asked where he found it, Bo said it was just sitting on his desk. Sue happily pinned it in her hair, knowing the Duke couldn't take back something his heir had given her. Bo was blown away by how good it looked on her. Eating up his compliments, she figured the Duke of Miramonte's past really wasn't her problem. Now she just needed to focus on getting that cash she was promised in the contract. Just 1 day left till the wedding, and Sue was totally wiped from going over the party plans. It was driving her nuts how meticulously these aristocrats plan events, thinking about every single move. Duke Shantak walked into Marlene's room to make sure she'd memorized all the rules. She asked him what he took her for, saying it was a piece of cake to learn them. He told her to get some sleep then, so she wouldn't fall behind schedule tomorrow, and left the room. But Sue bolted after him, grabbed his sleeve, and asked him to hang on a sec. Since he was already there, she smiled and suggested they rehearse the whole thing. The Duke didn't refuse, took her hand, and led her toward the window, showing her how they'd walk to the altar. She couldn't help but feel like the whole thing was making her super anxious. Sue was amazed at how chill Shantak was, the day before his own wedding. Looking at his totally stone-cold face, she said it would all be over soon. She imagined Mel chewing her out when she got back, then remembered he was at school, so they wouldn't see each other right away. Sue told Shantak that her little brother wanted to be a knight, and she was paying for his training. The girl looked intently at the Duke and said he probably had a brother too. Miramonte turned away and, sighing, replied that he actually did have one. Looking at him then, the heroine suddenly realized the prince was wrong to say the Duke was incapable of love. The man standing before her didn't seem nearly as emotionless as everyone said. More like someone had carved out his ability to feel anything at all. Shantak raised the girl's hand and pressed his lips to it, just like the plan said. Sue stared at him silently, trying to figure out how things had gotten to this point. It wasn't until Miramonte wished her goodnight that she snapped back to reality. She declared she was totally set on this wedding, and they were gonna make it work. Without turning around, Shantak told her, like always, to get as much sleep as she could. The next morning, the city streets were packed with people, all there to see the Duke and his bride off to the temple. Sue was complaining about how little sleep she was getting, and the Duke was all, "Come on, don't start dozing off now." Sticking to the script, she smiled and waved at the crowd, playing the part of the happy bride. She almost cried watching the Duke's knights toss gold coins into the crowd. She just didn't get these fancy weddings where, instead of getting gifts, the couple gives them away. It blew her mind how much the people loved and respected the Duke, calling him the hero of Villeton. That guy was definitely carrying the weight of everyone's admiration and sky-high expectations. Unable to hold back, Sue asked if His Grace's shoulder was bothering him. Shantak didn't catch on at first, then chuckled, playfully flicking her forehead and calling her a cheeky one. Sue realized he was right. It was just a contract, and she was sticking her nose where it didn't belong. She blushed, realizing she'd acted so presumptuously, like she was actually his wife. Making such a careless mistake wasn't like her at all. She needed to keep her distance from the guy she had to deal with. Sue needed to act professionally as a partner, and not pry into his personal life. Finally, the couple arrived at the temple, where His Majesty was already waiting. Javier stood and walked to meet them, reiterating that he didn't trust Shantak one bit. He said he only let this happen because he saw some potential in this arrangement. And regardless, the king congratulated Miramonte on his marriage. And for the young lady, His Majesty has prepared a wedding gift. It was a piece of jewelry made in the shape of the noble family's crest, as a sign that from now on, Marlene would belong to the Miramonte family. The king expressed his hope that the young lady understood what it meant to bear that name in the lands of Villeton. The archbishop was also happy to unite Lord Miramonte in marriage. He placed his palm on Marlene's head and blessed the future duchess. At that very moment, the heroine fully realized exactly what role she was meant to play. From now on, she would be the duchess, blessed by the king and the archbishop, the wife of Villeton's beloved hero. The girl reminded herself once again that this shouldn't break her, because it's just another con. The bride and groom approached the altar and vowed to love each other until death do them part. Despite her strong desire to back out of this marriage, Sue smiled and said, "I do." The priest announced it was time to seal their union with a first kiss. The heroine flinched. This wasn't part of the deal. Shantak took her hand, pulled her close, and whispered in her ear to remember to smile. Then they kissed, and Sue felt the heat of his lips. She blushed, blaming it on the fact that it was her first kiss ever. When the event finally ended and the newlyweds went to Shantak's room, Sue stood in the middle of the bedroom, frozen. She felt bummed about how her first kiss went down. Finally shaking off her worries, the heroine asked why she couldn't sleep in her own room. The Duke explained that spending their wedding night in separate rooms might raise eyebrows with the butler, who was right outside the door. Shantak started undressing, clueless about what was making Sue so flustered. The girl blushed again, trying to convince the Duke that she didn't have anything weird on her mind. Suddenly, Miramonte announced that he'd been so busy with the wedding preparations, he'd totally forgotten to tell her something. He had to head north the very next morning to lead the war against Bellium. When the newlyweds went to bed, the heroine couldn't close her eyes. She was afraid to fall asleep, worried the Duke would see her other side. Sue turned on her side to get a good look at Shantak's room, which she was seeing for the first time. There was a stack of documents on the desk, which this boar obviously worked on even on his wedding day. The girl turned toward the Duke, who was sleeping peacefully. It cracked her up to think that even someone like him was worn out by the exhausting wedding. Sue's laughter woke Shantak, and rubbing his eyes, he told her to get some sleep. She apologized, and out of nowhere, he reached out and put his hand on her head. Miramonte took a strand of her hair and just lay there silently, studying it. Realizing he was doing it half asleep, Sue was shocked and too scared to even twitch. She suddenly thought about Shantak coming back wounded from another war, and it made her sad. Sue reminded herself to ditch this wishful crush and turned away from him. Looking at her, the Duke suddenly said her hair was too light. She smiled and asked if it was keeping him awake, but Shantak said no. He wanted to say something else, but instead just touched her hair with his lips and drifted back to sleep. Sue's face flushed. She was dying to know what he'd wanted to say, but Shantak couldn't hear her anymore. From the moment she woke up, she couldn't stop replaying what happened last night in her head. The Duke was already awake, but the girl was annoyed by even the birds singing outside the window, which seemed too loud. Miramonte stretched and started taking off his nightrobe. Sue didn't understand what was happening when he suddenly leaned over her and told her to do the same. The Duke sighed and explained that the butler was about to appear in the room any minute. Just as he predicted, there was a knock at the door at that very moment. The butler entered the bedroom and froze, embarrassed by the scene he saw. A half-naked Shantak was lying on his side, slightly covered by a blanket, holding Lady Marlene close. The servant announced that breakfast was ready and left the room, and only then did the Duke let go of Sue and begin to get dressed. She refused his offer to call a maid to help her get dressed, as she felt more comfortable doing it alone. The thought of what happened last night just wouldn't leave her head. Helen came into the room, wished the lady a good morning, and held out the dress she'd prepared for Marlene. She told her to hurry because His Majesty had arrived at the estate. Helen offered the lady her help, and the girl happily accepted. When Sue was ready, she went down to the living room to greet His Majesty. Turns out, the king came to the duchy in person because he felt bad about having to split up the newlyweds on their wedding day. But he promised it would only take a couple of weeks since Shantak just needed to quell some unrest up north. After hearing Javier's words, she turned and looked at the Duke with a look full of sorrow. The guy remained totally unfazed. Even though he was about to head off to the battlefield, Sue walked over to Shantak and gently touched his shoulder. The Duke turned around and saw that strange look on her face again. She gave him that same look at the wedding rehearsal that night, and during the wedding procession itself. Then, a tear suddenly welled up in her eyes and slowly trickled down her cheek. Covering her face with her hands, Marlene begged His Grace to be careful and watch himself on the battlefield. She said she couldn't even bear to think what would happen to her if anything happened to him. Miramonte pulled the girl close, hugged her gently, and promised to return safe and sound. The king watched what was happening with a smile. Shantak told Marlene he was leaving Fernando to protect her, then took a strand of her hair and touched it with his lips. At the same time, he whispered to Sue that he'd warned the butler to keep a closer eye on the valuables. The Duke strongly suggested she not even think about lifting anything while he was gone. One day, after Shantak had left Miramonte, the prince showed up to pay Marlene a visit. She was pissed he showed up, Just because the Duke was out of town didn't mean his stay away from her order was lifted. Arthur admitted he just wanted to see Sue after all this time, and used the wedding as an excuse. Before she could even answer, he laughed and suggested she get a divorce. The prince thought Shantak leaving was the perfect opportunity to split, and promised no one would judge her for it. Sue warned Arthur if he brought up divorce. One more time, she'd personally throw his ass out. Ignoring her completely, the prince was just genuinely happy he got to see her again. He told her that noble ladies usually throw a little tea party after the wedding, but Sue hadn't done anything like that, so Arthur came to check if she was okay. She confessed that she felt awkward around all these new people. Arthur just kept wondering how she wasn't bored being alone all the time. To shut down any more pressure from him on the subject, Sue said she was swamped with stuff now that she was a duchess. Between everything else, she was buried in the books and getting into some little hobbies. Arthur perked up, wanting to know what kind of hobbies she was into, so she got up, grabbed a deck of cards off the dresser, and asked if he wanted to play a round of raquet. She figured since he'd come to see her, he must have nothing better to do, so they might as well play a game. Arthur was thrown for a loop and admitted that Sue was the only one who ever acted like that with a prince. She didn't back down and suggested they play for stakes to make it more interesting. She was dying to know as much as possible about the Duke, especially why the prince had said he'd taken care of Camilla. Plus, she wanted to know how true the rumors were about Shantak. Well, let's just say he'd done something really bad to his brother. This time, Sue was determined to squeeze every last drop of information out of Arthur. The prince agreed and was about to name his terms, but she cut him off, declaring that divorce was off the table. An awkward silence hung in the air, because Sue was staring at Arthur so intensely he didn't even dare finish his sentence. Then, with a smirk, he said that, honestly, there wasn't much else he really wanted. The girl told him to think hard, figuring there had to be something else he wanted from her. Arcturus took her hand and asked if in that case, she'd finally show him how she looked in that fairy outfit. Sue huffed, annoyed, wondering why he was so hung up on that dumb costume. And then Arcturus confessed that he really just wanted to hold her, like Cynthia. Even though the girl was shocked by his honesty, she finally agreed. Sue had no doubt she'd win, since these kinds of games were totally her thing. The heroine and the prince went to the gazebo, and before dealing the cards, the girl asked about his skills. Arcturus admitted he wasn't very good, because his face always gave him away. But since raquet was a game for nobles, it wasn't exactly new to him. Turns out, Camilla was the first one to teach the prince this game. Seeing Sue freeze up after he said that, Arthur chuckled, because her reaction told him exactly what kind of info she was fishing for. The girl suggested they start a game, confident that a casual player like the prince couldn't beat a pro. Just a couple of minutes later, Sue actually pulled out a win. Arthur practically jumped out of his skin, but the girl just laughed, claiming the gods of Rakata were obviously on her side. And since she won, Sue asked the prince to tell her everything he knew about the Duke, starting from where he left off last time. She wanted to know what he meant when he said Beau's mother suffered because of Shantak. Arthur turned away, annoyed, asking why the Duchess was asking him about her own husband. In response, the girl faked a tear and said the Duke was keeping things from her that might hurt her feelings. And as his wife, she just wanted to understand Shantak and comfort him. Arcturus shot back that he'd spill everything to Sue, but only if she promised to divorce the Duke. His words pissed her off so bad, the prince had no choice but to sit down and start his story. Even though Shantak was the Duke's son from a mistress, he had a crazy natural talent for fencing since he was a little kid. The kid stood out so much, he caught the king's eye. And Camilla, who was the prince's etiquette teacher, had been crushing on Shantak since she was young. She followed him everywhere, but he kept telling her to knock it off. Camilla was super offended by his coldness, and she called him a jerk who probably didn't even have any friends. She offered him her friendship, but he turned her down again. When she said there were plenty of guys who liked her, he just coldly told her to go to them and quit bothering him. But Camilla was into Shantak because she was sure they were a lot alike. Like him, she was also born to one of the Duke's companions, so she knew exactly what it was like to live under the Duchess's watchful eye. Besides, Camilla was convinced that the two of them were way more talented than the legitimate heirs. The girl thought this coincidence was nothing short of destiny. Shantak was skeptical about that idea, seeing as Camilla's sister was only 3 years old, and there was no way to know if she'd be more talented when she grew up. Plus, he never thought he was better than his brother, who, in his opinion, was way more awesome than he was. One time, Camilla asked Arcturus about her looks, and he said she was pretty cute. Then she complained to him that Shantak kept rejecting her, probably because he liked someone else better. The girl asked the prince if he liked Cynthia, and the boy said yes. Camilla wanted to know if he liked the fairy more than her, and Arcturus confirmed it again. The girl was furious that she was losing out to even a plant, no matter how much the prince tried to convince her that she mattered to him too. Being number one was all Camilla cared about. She declared, all dramatic-like, that her heart was now totally shattered. When the prince turned 8, His Majesty appointed Shantak as his fencing instructor. Miramonte held out a wooden practice sword to Arcturus, but the boy snapped it into splinters with a single press. And even though Shantak figured the prince just didn't like the weapon, he suddenly announced that he was the one he didn't like. Miramonte took this statement completely calmly and didn't even ask what the reason was for such dislike. This pissed Arcturus off even more, and he ordered Shantak to ask him what the reason was. When the question was finally asked, the prince declared he was angry because Miramonte had made Camilla suffer. However, the guy didn't feel obligated to answer for the girl's one-sided obsession. Arcturus went ballistic and swung his inhumanly strong fist at Shantak. But just as he lunged to strike, Miramonte casually brushed him aside. Before the prince could even react, the duke grabbed his wrist, causing him serious pain. Shantak explained that Arcturus needed to learn to control his impulses, because if he kept swinging his fists around without thinking, he could end up breaking someone's bones. He himself was only okay because he managed to block the blow. Since the prince possessed exceptional physical strength, Shantak suggested he train in actual combat and rolled up his sleeves. Arcturus pointed out that fighting a member of the royal family was a crime, but the duke explained that it was just sparring and ordered him to come at him. A while later, the defeated prince lay face down on the ground. He was furious and threatened to have Shantak thrown in jail immediately, but the duke was just surprised that the kid still had the energy to shout. Even though Arcturus yelled at him to never come near him again, Miramonte said goodbye until their next session. As Shantak was leaving, he ran into Camilla on the way. She laughed and asked how their first lesson with the prince went. The girl pointed out that now he, just like her, was the prince's teacher. Shantak told Camilla to stop trying to find pointless connections between them and just get on with her life. Sitting on the grass, Arctur watched as Miramonte broke another girl's heart. The prince suddenly stopped his story and froze, hearing some weird noise. Sue chuckled, guessing it was probably just a raccoon. Arctur was horrified by that idea, because there's no way those animals should be anywhere near the castle. He got up, peeked over the edge, and saw some kid crawling around in the bushes. Sue admitted that she knew the kid. Then, out of nowhere, she rattled off every single card the prince was holding, perfectly. Arcturus was floored when he found out how the girl really won. That kid was hiding behind the prince, signaling her what cards he was holding. Sue was busted, so she didn't deny it, and thanked Arcturus for the fun game and the intel. And while the prince was yelling after her about what a terrible person she was, and that he'd never play with her again, she was already gone from the gazebo. Now the heroine knew that the duke was illegitimate, and Beau's mother was dogging him everywhere. Even though it wasn't the info she was hoping for, Sue still managed to dig up something useful. Coming out into the courtyard on the other side of the estate, she tossed her little helper a gold coin. As for their conversation with His Highness, the girl said there was no need for the boy to know the details. Left alone in the gazebo, Arcturus was thinking about Sue. That girl was always way more cunning and quick than she seemed at first glance. The prince couldn't wrap his head around it. Were all the people from Ardell like this? He decided to investigate. Meanwhile, our girl, dressed in disguise, took her delivery boy to the nearest dive to treat him to lunch. She was surprised that nobody seemed worried about the Duke going off to war. Unlike her, the kid wasn't surprised at all. Sue thought it was because the Duke always came back from war in one piece, but he said that wasn't it. The quick little dude signaled that he'd only spill the beans after she paid up. Jang flipped the gold coin in his hand and figured Sue must not know the story everyone in Vahe knew, since she was from Ardell. And when she asked what he was talking about, he said it was the story of how the Duke, let's just say, removed his older brother to get the title. Who knows how true the gossip was? But people said the former Duke was healthy, and his sudden passing raised eyebrows. Besides, it was no secret His Majesty favored Shantak. Word on the street was, the king straight up offered the old duke a chance to hand the title over to his brother. But when he heard that, he just laughed it off. You couldn't find a more decent aristocrat in the whole kingdom than Theodore Miramonte. Shantak had him beat by a mile when it came to swordsmanship and brains, but Theodore was a genuinely good dude. The duke always had the backs of the regular folks in the back alleys, and a lot of them still remember him fondly. Still, you couldn't say Shantak had a bad rep. The duchy even started to thrive under his rule. It's just that the previous duke was so well loved. People were trying to stay loyal to his memory. Shantak earned the title Sword of Villetan when he was only 20. He was more of a war hero than a land baron, protecting the whole kingdom, not just Miramonte. And Theodore was the guy who was always right there with his people, looking out for them up close. I guess, in the eyes of the people, Shantak came off as a bit of a hard ass. Thing is, our girl had also seen a completely different side to this guy. Jang asked Sue if it was really okay for the Duchess to leave the estate every day and hang out in a place like this. She explained that she felt more comfortable this way, because otherwise she'd be stuck entertaining the prince, and he was still pushing her to divorce the duke for no good reason. The kid smirked, saying that crazy jerk Arcturus clearly had zero taste. At their next meeting, a messenger brought Sue Mel's report card. She was super nervous when she opened the envelope, but the worry vanished pretty quick when she saw the good grades on the report card. The kid guessed that Mel was the Duchess's brother, and Sue asked what gave her away. Jang explained that he's got younger brothers himself, and he knows how good it feels to hear good news about your family. Besides, Mel always seemed super happy whenever he got letters from Sue. That was awesome to hear, because she was really worried that being gone during his awkward teenage years would make him forget about her. The kid admitted he'd be stoked to have an older sister like her. Sue ruffled Jang's hair, laughing, because the little hustler was just saying that because she'd fed him a couple times. The kid pointed out that she sure didn't act like a duchess when she did that. She smiled and told him that in this messed up world, you gotta find even little reasons to smile, to make it worth living. Jang agreed, but he looked kinda bummed out when he said it. The day was winding down, time for dinner, so Sue handed the kid a bag of bread for his little brother. She told him to say he earned it himself, fair and square. Jang thanked Sue and confessed that, thanks to her, life suddenly didn't seem so damn hard. He got all awkward after that confession, so he said his goodbyes and bolted home. Left alone, she sprawled out under the tree and got lost in thought. Every time she saw Jang, he reminded her of her own childhood spent hustling in the back alleys. Back then, Sue was desperate for someone to lend her a hand, so Yang shouldn't thank her now, because by helping him, she was helping the version of herself she saw in him back then. Sue had been living on the fringes for so long. Even her good deeds had become self-serving. It was time to head back to the estate, and as she got up, she noticed Jang had left his cap behind. She figured she could catch him if she hurried, so she took off after the kid. Reaching the right alley, she saw a whole crowd of people had gathered. Sue decided to see what was up too, and started pushing her way through the throng. When she finally saw what everyone was gathered around, horror etched itself onto her face. The girl's hands went limp, and the cap she was holding dropped to the ground. Jang, who she'd just been chatting with happily under the tree, was lying against the wall, a gaping wound in his stomach, and the bread she'd given him was scattered nearby. She walked over to the sobbing boy next to him, assuming he was his younger brother, and asked what happened. The boy just stared at her, his eyes wide with terror, and kept hiccuping. Then he started hugging Jang's body again, and Sue realized he couldn't speak. She stood there, frozen, not knowing how to tell a kid to let go of his brother. She knew better than anyone that that body wasn't even worth a handful of ashes anymore, because Sue herself knew how pointless it was to live clinging to the dead. But kids facing death for the first time don't know that. That's why he was crying, clutching a body that was about to turn cold any second now. The heroine took off her cloak, covered Django with it, and promised to give him a proper burial. She scooped up the body and called for the crying boy to follow her. But when Sue turned around, she was met with judging stares from the crowd. Sue had to turn and run the other way to avoid them. A divine king resided in Vaha, so no one but the nobility could be buried in that land. Returning to the earth for rats roaming the alleys was an impossible dream. But the deaths Sue had to face even now weren't the deaths of sewer rats. They were just kids who hadn't even blossomed yet, like wildflowers. In one of the back alleys, a strange guy called out to Sue, telling her to dump the body on the ground. He blocked her path, and declared that this jerk's death should be a lesson to the rest of the kids in this alley. That's exactly why the killer left the body where it would be found easily. The kid was supposed to kick back 90% of his take, but the lowlife tried to hide his earnings till the very end. With those words, the perp walked up to Sue to take Jang's body from her. The heroine was shaking with rage, disgusted that anyone could be such a scumbag as to kill kids. She called him a piece of garbage, shaking down kids way younger than him for what they barely scraped together, and acting like it was something to be proud of. The killer, totally losing it, shoved Sue, called her a real piece of work, and told her to stay in her lane. The girl fell, and he kept ranting about who she thought she was, sticking her nose where it didn't belong. The jerk decided to teach her a lesson she wouldn't forget, pulled a dagger, and raised it, ready to strike. Clutching Jang's body close, Sue squeezed her eyes shut, mentally saying goodbye. But the blow never came, and when the heroine opened her eyes, she was shocked to see Shantak grabbing the killer's arm. The scumbag didn't even have time to react before the Duke slammed his head against the wall with everything he had. He threatened to take the guy's head and put it on display in the town square, so everyone would know what happens when you commit murder in Miramonte. Sue gasped and begged His Grace to stop. She explained that these people wouldn't back down anyway, and if he did that, they'd retaliate against the children. Shantak dropped the guy's limp body to the ground, turned around, and asked Sue what she was thinking, going to such a dangerous place. It was only then that he noticed the blood on her cloak, the one she'd used to cover the kid in her arms. The Duke rushed to her side, terrified that the lowlife had hurt her. The girl lowered her head and whispered that it wasn't her blood. A downpour started, and they just stood there for a while, unable to say a word. After finding a suitable place, Sue and Shantak buried Janga. Sue patted her little brother on the head, telling him to go home. She said he could visit the grave every day if he wanted to. After the boy left, Shantak told Sue he'd handed the perp over to the city guard, and he'd face justice. The Duke also beefed up security in the alleys around here, so the kids will be safe for a while. Sue thanked him for looking out for the other kids, and for letting them bury the boy here. This was the very spot where Jang loved to hang out. He liked it because the wind blew so cool, it made him feel free. Shantak walked up to her, gently touched her cheek, and told her not to cry. He wiped away a tear, and only then did she really feel how much she was hurting. Memories of Jang's last words flashed through her mind. The pain just exploded out of her. Sue started sobbing, and the Duke pulled her close, letting her cry it all out against his chest. She just couldn't wrap her head around how life could be so messed up.